The girl who dragged a half-frozen stranger out of the snow behind the old glassworks did not know she had just saved the one man in Ohio most determined to tear her home down to the studs. It was the 3rd week of December, and the cold that year had teeth. In the neighborhood, everybody still called Milrow, even though the mill had been shuttered for going on 20 years. The wind came off the Coldwater River and slid under doors and around window frames like it was looking for something to take. Wren Kelleher was 11, small for it, with a knit cap 2 sizes too big, pulled down over hair the color of wet straw, and she was out before the sun, because mornings were when the recycling bins along Delaney Street were fullest, and the trucks hadn't come yet. She had a system. Blue bin for cans, the deposit ones from Michigan plates, worth a dime instead of a nickel if she was lucky, tucked into a garbage bag slung over her shoulder like Santa, if Santa had holes in his gloves. Cardboard, flattened and stacked by the corner where Mr. Okonkwo from the corner store would give her a quarter for a good load. Glass she left. Glass was heavy and paid nothing and cut you through denim, and Wren had learned young that some things aren't worth the blood. Her grandmother would still be asleep when she got back, and that was the point. Fay Kelleher was 69, and her hands had quit on her by degrees over 4 decades of piecework, first at the glassworks and then, after that closed, at the sewing plant out on Route 9, that closed too. Now her knuckles were swollen into knots she couldn't always straighten, and cold mornings were the worst of it. Wren had figured out that if she did the bins before Fay woke, her grandmother wouldn't insist on coming, wouldn't stand out in that wind flexing her ruined fingers and pretending it didn't hurt. So Wren went alone, and she came back with cocoa mix ready to stir into hot water, and they didn't talk about the arithmetic of it. That was their arrangement, unspoken, the way the best arrangements between people who love each other usually are. That morning the snow had come down soft and thick overnight, and then quit, leaving everything hushed and clean and white in a way Milrow almost never got to be. Wren liked it like this. She liked how the burned-out shell of the glassworks looked less like a tombstone and more like a castle, and she was cutting behind it on the river path, the shortcut, when she saw the shape. At first she thought it was trash bags. A lot of things looked like a person in the half-dark and turned out to be trash bags, or a snowdrift, or once a dead deer, and Wren had gotten cautious about the shapes. But this one had a shoe, a brown leather shoe, the good kind, with a little gold buckle, and it was pointing at the sky at an angle no shoe points if there's still a foot doing its job inside it. "Hey," she said. Her breath hung in front of her. "Hey, mister, nothing." She should have run. That was the rule, one of Fay's rules, along with don't put your hand in a bin without looking, and don't get in cars, and don't tell strangers where you live. A grown man lying in the snow behind an abandoned building could be a drunk, could be worse, could be pretending. But something about the stillness of him was wrong in a way that made her chest go tight. And Wren had never in her life been very good at running from a thing that needed her. Her mother had been the same. It was the one piece of Colleen she was sure she'd gotten, that inability to walk past. She crunched closer. The man was on his side, one arm flung out, snow already settling into the creases of a coat that cost more than everything Wren owned and had ever owned put together, a gray wool coat with a collar and buttons like little coins. His face was the gray of the snow's underside. There was blood, dark and frozen, matted into the silver hair above his ear, and a purple swelling there the size of a plum. When she got her mittened hand under his cheek, his skin had a cold to it that scared her worse than the blood did, because it was the wrong kind of cold, a deep cold, a cold that had gotten in and settled. "Mister." She shook his shoulder. "Mister, wake up, you can't sleep here, you'll die out here." His eyelids fluttered. Not open, just fluttered, like a moth against a screen, and a sound came out of him that wasn't a word. Wren Kelleher was 11 years old and 81 pounds, soaking wet, and the man was well over 6 feet and dead weight, and there was not one part of the physics that worked in her favor. But she got behind him and she got her arms hooked under his, and she planted her boots in the snow, and she pulled, and she pulled, and she pulled, cursing in the words she wasn't supposed to know, and she moved him maybe 2 feet before she had to stop and breathe. Then she did it again. It took her the better part of 20 minutes to drag him the 40 yards to the mouth of the alley, where the ground was flatter. And by the end she was crying, without noticing she was crying, and the man had made the moth sound twice more, which was the only reason she kept going. As long as he made the sound, he wasn't a dead deer. She left him propped against the brick where the wind couldn't reach, and she ran the rest of the way home with her lungs burning, the abandoned garbage bag forgotten in the snow, worth $2, the most valuable thing she'd ever left behind and never once thought about again. Faye was up. Faye was standing at the counter in her housecoat with the electric kettle going, and she turned when the door banged open, ready to scold, and then she saw her granddaughter's face. "There's a man," Wren said. "Behind the glassworks. He's freezing to death, Graham. His head's all hurt. I couldn't carry him. I need you. I need help." Faye Keller had buried a husband and a daughter, and most of the dreams she'd started out with, and she did not waste time on questions when the answer was already obvious. She was already reaching for her coat. "Get the sled," she said, "the plastic one under the porch, and every blanket off both beds. Go." They got him onto the toboggan on the second try, the two of them, an old woman with hands that wouldn't close and a child, and they hauled him back through the snow with the runners squeaking. It shouldn't have been possible, and Faye would say later that she didn't rightly know how they'd done it, except that you find out what your body has in it when there's no other choice on the table. They got him up the 2 steps. They got him onto the couch that Colleen used to sleep on when she was small. And then Faye did the things you do, the things she'd learned from a lifetime of no doctors within reach and no money if there had been. Wet clothes off, dry blankets on, warmed first over the oven vent, warm, not hot, a hot water bottle at the core of him, not the hands and feet, because she'd seen a man die of that once, warmed wrong, the cold blood rushing back to the heart all at once. She cleaned the gash above his ear, and it wasn't as deep as the blood had made it look. She got broth into him a spoonful at a time when he came around enough to swallow. He came around slow. All that first day he drifted, surfacing and sinking, saying words that didn't connect. A name, Grayson, said twice like a warning the word river, once clearly, in a voice gone thin and afraid, "Don't." Faye sat with him through it. Wren sat with him too, when she wasn't being sent to fetch things, and she studied his face the way she studied the bird she drew, learning it. He had deep lines around his mouth that she decided were frown lines, not laugh lines. He had a watch on that she didn't touch, heavy and gold, worth she didn't want to think how much, and it hadn't occurred to her for 1 second to take it. And it hadn't occurred to Faye either, and neither of them ever mentioned it, because to them it wasn't worth mentioning. By the second morning his color had come back, and his eyes, when he opened them, tracked. They were pale gray, those eyes, and the first thing they landed on was Wren, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a stub of pencil and a scrap of grocery bag, drawing a chickadee from memory. "Where?" he said, and stopped, and tried again. "Where am I?" Wren looked up. "Milrow," she said, like that explained everything, which in her world it did. "You almost froze. I found you by the glassworks. You hit your head." She held up the drawing, because it seemed like the polite thing, the thing you'd want if you woke up nowhere. "This is a chickadee. They stay all winter. Most birds leave, but they stay." The man looked at the drawing for a long moment. Something moved behind his face that Wren couldn't name. His name was Desmond Ashford, though it would be 4 days before he said so, and by then it would matter a great deal more than it did now. He did not tell them at first, because at first he could not fully remember. The concussion sitting over his recent histories, like fog over the river. And then he did not tell them, because by the time the fog lifted, he had learned something that stopped the words in his throat. He had learned it lying on a stranger's couch, listening. He learned that the woman, Faye, gave him the last of the beef in the freezer, a quarter-pound she'd been saving for Christmas, boiled down into broth for a man who might be anybody, might be a criminal, might be nothing but trouble. And that when the girl asked, careful, if maybe they should keep some back, Faye said, "You feed the person in front of you, Wren. You worry about tomorrow." He learned that the girl gave up her own bed and slept on the floor by the couch so she could hear if his breathing changed, and that she had a book about birds from the library that was 4 years overdue because they couldn't pay the fine to return it, and she read it under a flashlight at night, like it was contraband. He learned that the house was 39 degrees in the rooms they weren't heating, and that they were only heating one, and that the reason was a gas bill Faye kept folded in a drawer, unopened, the way you keep a thing you already know the shape of. And he learned on the 3rd afternoon, when a man in a county coat knocked, and Faye stepped out onto the porch to talk to him low so the girl wouldn't hear. exactly what these two people were about to lose. Desmond didn't need to be told. He knew the county man's script by heart because he had written a version of it. He got up off the couch on legs that didn't entirely trust him, and he steadied himself against the window frame, and he looked out at Milrow in the gray afternoon light. The crooked houses, the leaning porches, the strings of Christmas lights somebody had put up anyway, defiant, on a street the maps had already given up on. He looked at the river beyond, and he understood, with the particular sick clarity of a man recognizing his own handwriting on a ransom note, exactly where he was. This was the river district. This was the parcel. This was the 11-acre stretch of the Coldwater riverfront that Ashford Development had spent 2 years, and a great deal of quiet money assembling, the crown of it. The project his own name would go on, 42 luxury townhomes and a marina, and a reimagined civic green, and the only thing standing between the renderings and the ribbon-cutting was the 11 or 12 holdout families of Milrow who had refused the buyout offers and were now, as of the county man on the porch, being informed that the offers were withdrawn, and the eminent domain filing had gone through, and they had until the end of January. He had signed that filing. He remembered signing it. He remembered saying, "To Grayson, to the room," that sentiment was the most expensive thing a developer could carry, and that these people would be better off with the check than the memories, and that in 10 years no one would remember there'd been anything here at all. He had been driving out to see the parcel one last time, before demolition, when the storm came in and the road iced under the bridge, and the wheel went light in his hands. That was the last thing before the girl's face. Faye came back inside with the folded county paper in her ruined hand and a stillness on her that Wren clocked instantly, because children always clock the stillness, and she said, "Gram?" And Faye said, "It's nothing for you to fret about, baby," which is the oldest lie in the language. And Desmond Ashford stood at the window of the house he was going to destroy and did not say a single word. That was the night he understood what he had made of himself. He had money. God knew he had money, more than his grandfather, the glassblower, could have imagined existed in the world. And there was a cruelty in that Desmond turned over and over in the dark, that his own grandfather had blown glass in the very building behind which he'd nearly died, had worked that furnace and gone home with burns and lung trouble to a house not 2 streets from this one, before an Ashford ever wore a coat with coin buttons. Desmond had spent 40 years climbing so far up out of Milrow that he'd been willing to pave it over, so he'd never have to see where he came from, and here it was. Here were the people, and they were kinder than anyone he knew. They were kinder than his money had ever made anyone toward him. Faye Kelleher had given a dying stranger her Christmas meat and her granddaughter's bed, and Desmond had given the city of Ellsworth an eviction notice. He got up in the dark and he sat in the chair by the couch where the girl lay sleeping on the floor with her library book fallen open on her chest, some warbler on the page, and, for the first time since he was younger than she was, Desmond Ashford put his face in his hands and wept, quietly, so as not to wake her. He wept for the man he'd let himself become. He wept for his grandfather's furnace. He wept because a child who had nothing had emptied her hands for him without a flicker of calculation, and he could not remember the last time he'd given anything to anyone without first working out what it would return. In the morning he told them his name. Not all of it. He told them he was Desmond, that he was from out of town, that he did some work in real estate, and every word was true, and every word was a coward's word, and he knew it, and he told himself he needed a few days to understand what to do, and that was true too. Faye took his hand, his whole hand, in both of her broken ones, gently, because gently was the only way they moved anymore, and she said, "Well, Desmond, you're welcome here till you've got your feet under you." And she meant it, and it went through him like a blade. He stayed 4 more days. He could have called Priya, his assistant, from the payphone outside Okonkwo's the first afternoon he was steady enough to walk there, and he did not. He told himself it was the concussion. It was not the concussion. It was that he did not want to go back yet to being Desmond Ashford, and he had not felt that way about being Desmond Ashford in 30 years. He made himself useful in the small ways a man can. He was clumsy at it at first, a man who had not washed a dish since the Reagan administration, but he learned. He learned to bank the stove so it held heat through the night. He learned, watching Faye's hands fail at a jar lid, to open it without making a thing of it, to just take it and turn it, and set it down like nothing had happened, because he'd seen how she hated the moment when something small defeated her. He walked the bins with Wren one bitter morning because she let him, and he was appalled at the math of it, that a child walked 2 miles in the cold for the price of a gallon of milk, and he said nothing, and he carried the heavy bag, and when she showed him how to spot the Michigan cans by the little arrows on the back, he felt, absurdly, prouder of learning it than of any deal he'd ever closed. Mostly he learned wren. He learned she drew birds because her mother had named her for one, a wren being a small brown thing that made an enormous sound out of all proportion to its size, and Colleen had told her that was going to be her too. He learned Colleen had died of a pneumonia that wouldn't have killed a person with insurance 3 winters back, and that Wren's father had never been anywhere to speak of. He learned the girl wanted, when she grew up, to draw the birds for the books, the real ones, the ones in the guides, so a kid like me could learn their names. He learned she had never once in her life had a new coat. And he learned that the demolition was set for the 2nd week of February, which meant that the marina his name would go on would be built on the exact patch of frozen ground where an 11-year-old had refused to let him die. He went back on the 8th day. He had to. The fog had cleared, and there were things a man who has been missing over a week must attend to, and there was a plan forming in him now, hard and bright and certain, that required the machinery of who he really was. He told Faye and Wren he had to see to his work and that he would be back, and Wren looked at him with those clear eyes that missed nothing, and said, "People say that." Not accusing, just reporting, the way she'd report that most birds leave, but the chickadee stays. And it was the truest and most damning thing anyone had said to him in years. "I'm not most people," Desmond said, and heard how it sounded, a rich man's easy promise, and hated it. So he took the drawing. She'd given him the chickadee, the first one, days ago, and he held it up. "You gave me this. A person doesn't leave without giving it back. I'll bring it back. That's not a maybe." It was the most solemn contract Desmond Ashford had ever entered, and he had signed contracts that moved millions. Priya nearly dropped the phone when he called. He'd been gone 9 days. There were 3 missing person reports, a sheriff's search that had found his wrecked car under the bridge, and no body, a stock dip, and a nephew, Grayson, who had spent those 9 days behaving like a man measuring the office for new furniture. Desmond listened to all of it in the phone booth, outside a corner store, while a girl he'd come to love in 9 days waved at him through the frost on the store window, and he found he did not much care about any of it except the last part. Grayson, his late brother's boy, whom Desmond had raised into the business because there'd been no one else, and he'd told himself it was loyalty, when really it had been a way of not being alone that didn't require him to feel anything. Grayson, who had, in Desmond's absence, gone to the board with concerns about his uncle's stability and a helpful proposal to accelerate the River District timeline and a set of numbers that skimmed, Desmond would discover, a good deal off the top into an account with Grayson's fingerprints on it. Sentiment is the most expensive thing a developer can carry, Desmond had taught him, and the boy had learned it too well and applied it finally to his uncle. Desmond went back to the world, and he moved through it like a man who had been given, at 58, a second set of eyes. He did not call the sheriff off himself for another full day, and in that day, quietly, through Priya, he pulled every thread, the account, the skim, the forged authorizations Grayson had run while Desmond was presumed dead in a snowbank. It was not hard. It is never hard to find the rot in a thing, once you have decided to look instead of look away. Then Desmond walked into his own office, alive, and let the room see his face, and let Grayson's face do the thing faces do when the ground goes out from under them, and he did not raise his voice once, because he'd learned something in Milrow about how the people worth respecting handle a crisis, and it wasn't with volume. "You'll resign," Desmond told him, in the office, with the door closed and the evidence in a folder between them. "Today, you'll sign the restitution, and you will be grateful, for the rest of your life, that I spent the last 9 days becoming the kind of man who would rather see you fix this than see you in a cell. A week ago I wasn't that man. You'd have gone to prison. You can thank a little girl on Delaney Street that you're not." Grayson, who did not understand and never would, signed. And then Desmond Ashford turned the full weight of the thing he'd built toward the one thing worth building. He killed the River District, not softened it, not amended it, killed the luxury version outright, ate the loss, took the write down in front of a board that thought he'd come back from the cold with his sense knocked loose, and maybe he had. Maybe that was exactly what had happened. He put the 11 acres into a community land trust, the deed structured so that no future Desmond could ever again decide that memory was too expensive and pave it under. The holdout families kept their homes, deeded free, the eminent domain filing withdrawn with an apology from the company on letterhead that Desmond dictated himself and made them reprint twice until the words were plain enough to mean something. The old glassworks he did not tear down. He had it made safe and made warm and made into what he told the architects he wanted, which was a place where the neighborhood's kids could go after school with tables and books and light, and where, he was very specific about this, there would be a wall, a long good wall, for showing children's drawings. He named none of it after himself. His grandfather had blown glass in that building for 30 years, and the sign out front when it went up in the spring said Kelleher Ashford Commons. And Fay Kelleher, when she understood what he'd done and why her family's name was on it, cried in a way Wren had never seen her cry, with her ruined hands over her face, and Desmond stood there and let her, because he had learned that too, that sometimes the kindest thing is not to fix the crying, but to be present for it. But that was the spring. First there was the 9th day, and the 10th, and a thing he had promised. He came back to the little house on Delaney Street on the shortest day of the year, 4 days before Christmas, exactly 2 weeks after a girl had pulled him out of the snow, and he came back different in every way that mattered, and the same in the one that counted, which was that he'd said he would, and here he was. He knocked. Wren opened the door and stood there in the 2 sizes too big cap, and behind her Fay rose slowly from her chair, and Desmond stood on the step in a coat with coin buttons and held out, first, before anything, before a single word about who he really was, the drawing of the chickadee, a little creased now from riding in his breast pocket for 9 days over his heart. "I told you," he said, "a person doesn't leave without giving it back." Wren took the drawing. She looked at it, and she looked at him, and something in her small, fierce face eased, some watchfulness she'd been carrying since long before he'd met her, and she said, "You came back," not surprised exactly, but marking it, the way you mark a bird you'd been told you'd never see, and Desmond Ashford, who had once told a boardroom that no one would remember there'd been anything here at all, understood that he would remember this for the rest of his life. Then he told them the rest of it, all of it. He sat at their small table with a cup of the weak coffee. Fay insisted on making him, and he told them who he was, and what he had been going to do to Milrow, and what he had done instead, and he did not spare himself in the telling, did not soften his own part, laid it out plain because they'd earned plain. He watched their faces change, and he made himself watch. Fay went very still. Wren's mouth opened and closed. There was a long moment where the whole thing might have curdled, where the girl might have understood, where the girl bifed wit she'd bled and wept to had been, that very week, the man scheduled to bulldoze her home, and where she might have looked at him with something Desmond wasn't sure he could survive. But Wren Kelleher was 11, and she had already forgiven a great deal in her short life because the alternative was to carry it, and she thought about it, really thought, in the serious way she did everything. "But you didn't do it. You were going to, and then you didn't." "That's," she frowned, "working it out. That's better than never wanting to at all. Anybody can be good if it was always easy." Fay let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for 2 weeks, and Desmond Ashford put his face in his broken hands. No, they were whole. It was Fay's that were broken. His were whole and soft and useless in every way that had ever counted until a girl taught them to bank a stove. And for the second time in 2 weeks, in that little house, he wept, and this time nobody had to be quiet about it. Here is what became of them, because the good that gets done quietly deserves at least to be told. The house on Delaney Street got a new furnace before Christmas, and a paid gas bill and a roof that didn't weep in the spring rains, and Fay Kelleher fought Desmond on every single one of these until he learned to do them the way she'd taught him to open the jar, without making a thing of it, just done, no ceremony, no debt implied. The library fine got paid, and the overdue bird book got returned, and the librarian, a soft-spoken woman named Priya's cousin as it turned out, Ellsworth being that kind of town, quietly saw to it that a new field guide, the good one, the Sibley, found its way into Wren's hands with no fine attached to anything. Ever again, Wren got a coat. A new one, the first of her life, forest green, and she was so careful with it the first week that she wouldn't lean against walls, and Desmond had to be talked out of buying her 9 more by Faye, who understood something about a child and a first good thing that the richest man in 3 counties was still learning. The Commons opened in May in the old glassworks, and the long good wall filled up fast with children's drawings, and the best of them, everyone agreed, were the birds. There was a woman who came Tuesdays and Thursdays to teach the kids to draw, a real illustrator from Columbus that Desmond had found and hired, and she took one look at Wren's chickadees and told Faye, plainly, that the girl had the thing that couldn't be taught and that she'd see to the part that could. Wren is 19 now. Her drawings are in a field guide, an actual one, the kind a kid in a cold house could check out and learn the names from. The dedication says, "For Colleen who named me, and for the 2 men who came out of the snow, my great-grandfather who blew the glass, and Desmond who put it back." Grayson made his restitution and moved to Arizona, and sends a card every Christmas that nobody quite knows what to do with. And Desmond answers everyone, because Milrow taught him that too, that you feed the person in front of you and let tomorrow's arithmetic wait. And Desmond Ashford, who had spent 40 years climbing out of a place so he'd never have to see it, moved back into it. He bought the crooked house next to Faye's, the one that had been a holdout too, and he fixed it up plain, no coin buttons, and he lived there, and on Sundays, every Sunday, not sometimes, not when it was convenient, every Sunday for the rest of Faye Kelleher's long life, and every Sunday after, with Wren once Faye was gone, there was a dinner. 3 of them at first, and then more as the neighborhood folded him in, at the little table that grew a leaf, and then grew a bigger table entirely. Wren would draw at that table, and Faye would preside from her chair, with her ruined, beautiful hands folded in her lap, and Desmond would do the dishes. And he was better at them now, and if you had told the man in the wool coat on the frozen riverbank that this was the fortune waiting for him, he would not have understood a word of it. He came to understand it. That was the whole of it. In the end, the only thing that had ever really changed, and the only thing that ever needed to. A man who had spent his life certain that things could be measured learned, at 58, in the cold, from a child with a stub of pencil, that the things that matter can't be, and that the only wealth that keeps is the kind you can only get by giving it away. Most birds leave when the winter comes, but some of them stay and make a home of the hard season, and sing anyway, out of all proportion to their size, into the cold. And if you are very lucky, and you keep your eyes open on a gray morning, one of them will find you where you've fallen, and refuse, for reasons it could never explain, and would never think to walk on past.